And therefore, I think the first step of decolonization is to look at the basic concepts and to mine the Quran for the basic concepts that could redefine our world. Not just the very clear ones, zawaj and zina, jihad and haraba. Perhaps we should bring them back to the discourse, but to look for more terms from the Quranic bank of mafahim and kalimat, al-asma' that al-sultan, the names that have authority. This is the Quranic names. To look for those names and to remake our indexes.
Thank you very much. 5 really provocative contributions. So I'm going to ask if there is any questions that panelists have for each other. So please feel free to raise your hand. And as people are thinking about it, I'll start off with a couple of questions. One for Professor Farid al-Attas. As you have put your finger on what you think is is one of the central problems, which is the university system, higher education. But what are, in your view, sociological reasons, perhaps other reasons, are there political reasons that you think that the Muslim world, like you made it a point to say that in the Muslim world, these are perhaps the best universities, and they're not very good at all. What is it about being Muslim that, in other words, obviously there are some non-Muslim neighbors that perhaps you could compare those two. So, please.
Thank you. Okay, so let me clarify. I'm not saying that it's, I don't mean to suggest that this is an exclusively Muslim world problem. It's a problem in much of the global South, this problem of standards of education in the universities. And there are different types of problems. Some of the problems are due to excessive bureaucracy, due to lack of funds. So for example, in many universities, you have no access to journals because the universities are not able to subscribe to the databases. Some of it is that. Some of it is corruption in the sense that hiring of academic staff is done on the basis of favoritism. This is a big problem in Malaysia, a big problem we face here with the universities. And the lack of oversight, of administrative oversight. And sometimes it is stupidity. For example, in our universities in Malaysia, we have a very stupid rule. And I mean, you think it's a joke. Professors, lecturers are not allowed to assign readings more than 5 years old. I mean, can you believe it? It's like a joke, right? But this is serious. This comes from the Ministry of Higher Education. And there are so many other things with regard to education, which we don't have time to get into. But I wanted to say this. One thing that we share in common with most universities in the global South is the Eurocentrism. And the Eurocentrism, both in the universities as well as outside the universities, in the media and so on and so forth, it functions to condition our minds to think in a way that is in line with the interests of imperial powers. Let me just give you a very simple example. We speak about the occupation of Palestine. Now, this is actually a wrong term. It's not an occupation. An occupation is a temporary control of a foreign power, of a land by a foreign power. It's temporary, it's military occupation. The Japanese occupied Malaya. The Japanese occupied Singapore. But they did not occupy Taiwan. They colonized Taiwan. It's a permanent thing. It involves settlement of the foreign power, development of institutions, and so on and so forth. Israel is not an occupying force. Palestine is colonized by Israel. since 1948. And by now, there are 3 forms of colonization that are taking place in Israel. You have settler colonialism. Israel proper is a settler colonial state, what is called Israel today, as well as parts of the West Bank. Other parts of the West Bank are ruled by Israel indirectly. It's what we call in Malaya in the colonial period indirect rule, because the British ruled parts of Malaya through the local elite, through the Malay rulers. And Gaza until October 7th was semi-colonized. It was a semi-colony, right? And no time to go into all the differences. But, it's sort of insulting, I think, to keep referring to the occupation, because you're minimizing. I know in our minds we are not minimizing it, but let us use the correct terminology and not simply use the terminology that is sold to us by the Western media and also adopted by our own media. So part of the Ummatic project, right, has to be a decolonizing project. And I think you need to be well versed in the post-colonialist literature and the decolonial literature, because they are dealing with the problem of Eurocentrism. They are dealing with the problem of how to think differently about the economy, and they are dealing about how to think differently about the interstate system. Beyond, reforming the United Nations, which is not a democratic institution, but how can we realign, the way the interstate system works that benefits, that brings more even benefits to the different states and the world's population.
Would anybody like to respond, please? But as you think about or respond to that, Sheikh Jasser, I wanted to add a question, which is, you also spoke about capitalism, but at the same time you spoke about working outside the system. And Dr. al-Attas spoke about categorizing forms of occupation more precisely, but you used a decolonial discourse, which is not indigenously Islamic necessarily. It has a good element of, if you will, Latin American experience, Indian, that is South Asian experience, Marxist experience. Similarly, when we speak of this entity called capitalism as an ism, its construction is indebted primarily to somebody like Marx, who studies it critically and then creates a discourse that we can then use to critique it. So I want to challenge you to a little bit about thinking about what does it mean to work outside the system, and particularly what does it mean to work in an ummatic frame?
The answer to that, to me, is to change the tasawurat, the definitions, the basic definitions. How do you define things? You can define it as capitalism and therefore fall into people who, whether are with capitalism or critiquing capitalism, versus defining the world in your own terms, in your own mafahim, concepts. Dulatan bayna al-aghniya. This is a Quranic concept, and therefore you go back to the Quran. And based on your concepts, you can start to create your own indexes. One of the problems with academia is the indices, this Scopus business and all of that. This is a way of controlling the discourse by basically making an index, a development index, a freedom index, a whatever you name it, teaching index, psychology, counseling, whatever it is, architecture. There are indexes that you have to tick, and then the governments enforce on the people. And these indexes, if you look at the terms, they are mafahim, they are concepts that are not Islamic. And therefore, I think the first step of decolonization is to look at the basic concepts and to mine the Quran for the basic concepts that could redefine our world. Not just the very clear ones, zawaj and zina, jihad and haraba, like not very clear. And the Quran is, perhaps we should bring them back to the discourse, but to look for more terms from the Quranic bank of mafahim and al-kalimat, al-asma' that is sultan, the names that have authority. This is the Quranic names. To look for those names and to remake our indexes. That's my...
Okay, excellent. Any questions, further questions or thoughts from the panelists for each other or in response?
Yeah, I just want to go further a little bit on this critique of capitalism. And this has been going on for more than 200 years. What a lot of the critiques of capitalism do not understand, at least Marx understood it, is that capitalism preceded modernity. It was there before modernity came. What made the difference when modernity came was the rise of colonialism, and that capitalism was fueled by the hegemonic Western powers that came, they became supreme in the world. Now, a critique of capitalism, the way I see it, melts into thin air if there is no discussion over the fact that superpowers are continuously fueling capitalism. China, that was supposed to be the alternative to American and Western capitalism, is now a capitalist superpower. There is a good political scientist, his name is Alistair Edwards. He wrote this very, very good book called Superstates, right? And in his argument, there are 5 superstates of the world. One of which is China, the other one is India, EU, America, and of course, we can contest that Russia might be one of them, but these 4 are the big superstates. All 4 superstates, he doesn't want to call it superpowers, are pro-capitalism. Hence, my point here is that criticizing capitalism, coming out with an alternative way of thinking will not really solve the actual problem on the ground. Capitalism will still reproduce itself, and until and unless another power comes into play, gets into the scene, and offer an alternative system, capitalism will still reinvent and assert itself. Now, within the literature on capitalism, there's a new wave of literature on what they call as ethical capitalism. And this is where Muslims have a place within that discourse. This is where we can come in and start talking about how Islam, and this is where I agree with Professor Jasser Auda, can provide the necessary nomenclature, theories, methodologies, to which capitalism can not only be criticized, but also be reformed in such a way that it would include Islamic ethical values. So I think the problem that we have as Muslims is that we are often negating things that come to us, be it ideas, be it paradigms. But if you look at Muslims in the past, and if you look at even Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they are able to tease out certain practices. That's why in usul fiqh, and again, our professors here are more informed on this, there is this concept called shar'un man qablana, where you take the shara before us. Very contentious in Shafi'i madhab. Shafi'is don't accept this. But the fact that the scholars actually come out with all of these tools only goes to show that there was an effort to try to deal with hegemonic paradigms in such a way that you can insert yourself within that paradigm and along the way change that paradigm to come in our way. So I just want to throw this out and let's have a discussion about it.
Okay.
I agree with you, but to a certain extent. Because yes, like when Muslim philosophers were engaging Greek philosophy and other philosophies, they were in a position of power. And so they could Islamicize philosophy, right? But we're not in a position of power right now. And I think, and I actually have a question. Who here would ever, be suspicious of their biomedical doctor's diagnosis? Okay, you're very few. Okay, but I'm saying like, it's rare. Like it is rare for a Muslim person to think that biomedicine is not Islamic, it's not something scientific, because we come to believe that this is a science, we should absorb it, like we shouldn't reformulate it. But I think you have to get into a position of power to think that you're able to manipulate a science. But I think right now what we're doing is we're consuming so much. And, you know, in my studies, and not to say I'm against ego psychology, but I am against ego psychology. You know, I hear Muslims use the term, for example, learned helplessness. But what you don't understand is learned helplessness comes from a very specific idea of yourself as an interior self, which is something that you can will against your soul, which has a little bit of a Protestant kind of origin. So we tend to utilize concepts, or we tend to utilize frameworks of sciences without actually knowing that they're un-Islamic, or they don't actually come from a Quranic point of view, but it would require us to be able to have actual pride in prior sciences that we had. And I think you would need to do that in order to think that you could like recreate that space of cosmopolitanism that we once had.
Yeah, I wanted to say, what I was trying to get at is that we need to, and I agree with what you were saying, you know, about thinking outside of the paradigms. We need to go beyond reform. We have to consider different options. Now, thinking about, for example, reforming capitalism, it's possible. It's not what I would actually prefer, because I think it's somewhat of a cop-out. And I think the debate has to be about whether capitalism can be reformed. I seriously doubt it can be reformed, because capitalism is founded on the exploitation of difference. That's why it started entangled with racism and slavery and misogyny. That's the history of capitalism, and it continues to be that way today. There's no incentive for capitalists to be in the business that they are if there aren't differences that can be exploited. So, but this is a debate we can have, right? And I think at least as far as Islamic economics is concerned, there is no such debate among them. Now, the rest of the world is thinking beyond capitalism. There is a whole debate on post-scarcity society, on post-money society, which we haven't begun to get into. This is not just thinking in the air. People are talking on the ground about possibilities. And you mentioned Latin America. In Latin America, there are actually communities that are not only talking about it in the abstract, but are organizing their lives in alternative ways. Although, of course, these are small communities, but they are showing the possibilities of opting out of the system. So that, I think, research has to be done along those lines. And just with regard to concepts, you said mining the tradition, the Quran, for example. I definitely agree with that. But in addition to that, the intellectual tradition of Islam, not just the Quran, not just the Hadith, but the intellectual tradition. In my case, I'm interested in Ibn Khaldun. But I would never say ignore or neglect the Western tradition and other intellectual traditions. Decolonial thought from Latin America is essential. There are concepts that are essential for us to use that do not come from Islamic tradition. For example, the concept of ideology. It's an important concept. It doesn't come from Islamic tradition. Concepts, wherever they come from, if they reflect the empirical reality, then they are useful. And by default, they are Islamic.
Yeah, so I see a very interesting tension, which is, for academics, the best thing when you can identify a tension, because then you have something to do. To what extent can we use foreign concepts? How fragile is Islamic self or Islamic culture? How far does it need to stay from the foreign powers? Or even the idea that because we are not in power, we might be more susceptible to foreign concepts, because in all honesty, Greeks sweep the floor with Muslim local understandings for 3 to 5 centuries. I can say that as a historian. And only it took centuries for people to begin to react to the foreign Greek ideas, sometimes accepted, but sometimes they recognized that they were foreign. And that was when Muslims were in power. On the other hand, sometimes when we are when we are not in power, we resist. And we resist sometimes not only what is bad, but what is good. So all of these things themselves are contestable. And where does this contestation take place, right? And even all of the language of contestation I've heard has taken place in the English language with concepts that are, in fact, one might say, elaborated in Western universities. And so I think that that's perhaps, my own approach, as I have, in fact, engaged in decolonial thought, and I absolutely agree with you that there needs to be Ummatic decoloniality. But what I often find with decolonialism is that it has no place to stand itself. So all of its sensibilities are, in fact, often created and recreated and reproduced by the particular struggles and, that are themselves conditions of modernity. And the very idea that perhaps decoloniality is simply an outgrowth of coloniality. And my point is simply that this is not an onion. There is something to ourselves. And perhaps what an Ummatic approach could be, in addition to a healthy amount of skepticism, is trust in God. Trust that the fitrah, the same nature that leads tens of thousands of people every month in the West, who are all ideologically part of or created by manufactured industrial processes of mind control and so on, and yet they choose Islam, and yet they are ready to resist. So I want to bring a little more optimism to this to our discussion before we open up the floor, which is now. So please, if you don't mind making a line by those mics, thank you very much.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you to all the presenters for a very enlightening discussion. My question is with regards to our local context here in Southeast Asia, or better known as Nusantara in the past. Is there a problem, and this question is to Dr. Aljunied, is there a problem of political will, in the sense that if we look at Malaysia, for example, we have many pro-Palestinian protests, but at the same time, there's issues with BlackRock, HP, and the like. So how do we reconcile the fact that we are Islamic with the fact that we are also very much secular? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. So I have a few questions here. To Prof. Farid, the idea of the discourse of decolonization in essence is anti-hegemony. So talking about Ummatic discourse and whatnot, how do we avoid being another hegemony against the hegemony of the Western countries, number one. Number two, to Prof. Khairudin, is quite ironic when you say that we negate always ideas from the West, but the idea that you try to make it positive is the capitalism. Why not how about we go to the direction to the, make positive of socialism, for example, expand the idea of ethical socialist discourse, for example, because that is much more closer to what Prof. Jasser Auda said, أَلَّا تَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ. So that is much more appropriate. So I need comment on that. And the third one for Prof. Brown is that when you say that the Western countries, act in the service of justice because there is international law. But we have not heard about the measures of accountability for our Muslim world leaders, where we see the accountability measures are like, where is it? Even Malaysia is not ratifying the Rome Statute that actually make our royal or monarchies, for example, accountable to the crime that they commit. So I would like to know what is the accountability measures in this Ummatic discourse, if you would like to, comment. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll typically take 3 questions, but this last intervention was just so rich, I think we'll stop there. No, I say that in all sincerity. I think they were all 3 brilliant questions. So Professor Junaid, and then whoever else wants to intervene, please do take 1 question if you can, and try to be concise.
All right, so the first question, if I get the question right, are we lacking of political will to resolve a lot of the problems in the Muslim world? I don't think we are lacking of that. I think we have a lot of political will, but as I was saying in my short reflections, I would say, we lack that unity of the hearts. This is the problem that we have right now. At the end of the day, the whole issue is the divides that you see in the Muslim, it's all mostly personal. And you don't have to go far. Just look left and right, and you can see it. And again, to move beyond the so-called circular way of looking at problems is to also acknowledge the importance of the interior, of the spiritual. Can I, in the National University of Singapore, teach about spirituality in class? I can't do that, right? So that brings me to the whole idea of reconciliation between the secular and the religious. Now, al-Attas has a very interesting essay on this, and Anjum Ovamir wrote a very powerful essay on al-Attas' idea of Islam as a discursive tradition. And he says, and I agree with him to some extent, that at the end of the day, the secular and the religious are mutually constitutive of one another. That whether we think we are out of a secular condition or whether we are in, the fact is that the reality that we are in are shaped by the kind of lives that we choose to have. Right? That then leads us to the issue of capitalism. I'm not in defense of capitalism. The very critique of capitalism buys Coach bags for their wives. I am criticizing the sheer hypocrisy of the people who criticize capitalism, but at the same time are a party of capitalism itself. If we do criticize capitalism in its truer sense, we cannot be based in certain universities. Because many of these universities that are out there in the world live, survive, and get to the top of the rankings based on the capitalist logic. So are we criticizing capitalism, but at the same time perpetuating capitalism? It's sheer hypocrisy. So I'm trying to say, in the spirit of Islam, which I hold on to very closely, that we must resolve the issue in a realist way, in a way which the Prophet has taught us, that in a condition where you are not in a position of power and control, the least that you can do is to construct first a new form of knowledge. Enough of criticisms, because we have done that quite a lot. We need more of it, but we need to get over the politics of knowledge through a production of new knowledge. And production of new knowledge requires then a rethinking. And this is where in my book, Shapers of Islam in Southeast Asia, I talk about Professor Osman Bakar, who engages the issue at the epistemological level, which Professor Nagib al-Attas have brought into our attention in the 1960s. Who in Malaysia is doing it right now? That's the other problem of political will, right? That leads me then to the issue of whether it's capitalism or whether it's socialism. I do not want both of them, right? To me, socialism is a response to capitalism. It is basically another side of the same coin. At the end of the day, we need to envision a system that can transcend the two systems that seemingly offer alternatives to how Muslims have lived their lives. This effort has been there. Please read the book by one of my teachers in SOAS, Charles Tripp, and the title of the book is Islam and the Moral Economy, published by Capitalist Press, Cambridge University Press. And he talks about how Muslims in the 1930s until the 1960s conceptualized many new systems and engaged with even socialist thought and also capitalist industrialist thought to come up with new imaginings of what a new economic system could be. So we need to move beyond the two discourses into coming out, to come out with our own. And that requires a lot of time, energy, and research, and the will, as you mentioned just now.
Thank you. Would anybody like to respond to the point about Ummatic hegemony being itself a fear?
I think you asked about hegemony. Okay, the topic of imperialism has been around for centuries. And so the phenomenon is not new. Maybe in Islamic circles, it's less discussed, less analyzed. Now, our governments, like Malaysia, sometimes our government does things which are seemingly not in the interests of fellow Muslim states, because of this hegemony, because of this pressure. And we need to understand that, right? It's not simply a matter of, they're oblivious and they don't know, or they don't have any sense of Islamic unity. Sometimes there are pressures which they are not able to avoid. Right or wrong is another matter. I'll give you a very simple example. An Iranian airline, Mahan Air, used to have direct flights from Tehran to Kuala Lumpur for many years. For many years. And Iran Air also used to come here. Recently, I think it was sometime last year, they stopped coming. Why? Because our airport refused to sell air fuel. So they were not allowed to, they could not refuel in Malaysia, in KLIA. They could not refuel because, they fly from Tehran to KL, they have to refuel to fly back. So they can't. Why? This is not covered by sanctions. There are no sanctions. It's not covered by US sanctions. But they cannot do that because Petronas, which sells the oil, is concerned about its investments in the US. They're concerned with repercussions, right? So here you have a matter of, so what I'm saying is, there is an issue of material interests. And the hegemony that America is able to exert on smaller economies is such that it's going to determine how we behave on the international scene. It's going to affect our international relations, our foreign policy, right? It's very easy to, I myself, I get angry, and I get angry with this hypocrisy. But it's far deeper than that. There is the issue of material interest. How can Muslim states act in a way that is consistent with the idea of Islamic unity without running afoul of these hegemonic powers? We have to act as a bloc. That is the only way. If you're acting, as discrete countries, you are small states, there's no way you're going to be able to satisfy your material interests and at the same time act consistently with, what is required to be, united. So I think this is essentially the material problem is. That's why I agree very much with Professor Jasser Auda about that there is the economic problem, which has to do with capitalism and exploitation. There is also the interstate system. That's the political aspect, and these have to be looked at together at the same time. And we're not just talking, or rather, we should not just be talking. In order to bring, while we are thinking about the kinds of system we can, economic and political system that we can have, the interstate system that we can have, there needs to be an intellectual and social movement on the ground that's our politics. We need to engage in a kind of politics that will bring about change, because the change is not going to start with our governments. In this sense, I'm a follower of Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun said that as a rule, governments are unjust. And he was studying, in his time, he was studying 500 years of government in the Muslim world. So don't wait for the governments to change.
Which one?
I just want to say about the court, international law. I mean, I don't want to stop your conversation.
Go ahead.
But I don't know why Malaysia is not signatory to the Rome Statute. But I mean, that's just one. I mean, that just deals with, I think, the International Criminal Court and like crimes against humanity, if I'm not mistaken. But I mean, the international law, I don't want to like fetishize it or something. I mean, because usually it's just, pretty standard points of moral consensus. You don't, rejection of torture, you shouldn't intentionally target civilians, commitment to minimizing civilian deaths in conflict, things like that, which are pretty, you don't have to be signatory to any particular statute, I think, to have a commitment to those things.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Here. I have two questions. One is the question about being a Muslim. What does it mean to be a Muslim with respect to the idea of being the anthropos, today? That is like the self, when we inquire ourselves. And then how does it relate to the definition of the Ummah? Because the limit of our discussion today, it seems that we have not defined properly what Ummah is with respect to our discussions. And then number two, with respect to the question of history, how can it assist us as a corpus, body of knowledge, to align with the cosmology and cosmogony both? In terms of, when I read the Quran, we read about the Jalut and Talut, the giants and the small ones, and then the Bilqis and Sulaiman. And then trying to make sense or relevantize it with respect to the inquiry about study in political science, for instance. When we think about the ideal, about the power, sovereignty, glory, dignity, with respect to present idea about hierarchy of power. Thank you.
All right. Who would you like to respond? Would you? Go ahead.
In terms of Ummah, there are different levels of Ummah. There is the Ummah of the believers. If you go back to the Quranic framework, the Ummah of the believers, that's an Ummah. And there is also Ummam of birds and animals, Ummam of people. Any dissection of a particular category is an Ummah. We're talking Ummatics, we're talking about the Ummatics of believers, I assume, that it is the Muslims, the followers of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and all the prophets before. I also agree with Prophet al-Attas on the importance of ideas. Practicality should not hinder us from research and theorizing and talking, because as he mentioned, talk will eventually translate into social movements and institutions and will change the world. And yes, you could be in a capitalist institution and critique capitalism. Marx was funded by Engels at the end, a capitalist guy. But basically, what you are trying to do is to manufacture ideas. Ideas are very important to manufacture. And I propose to you that we focus more on Quranic studies, but not in the traditional way, not in the tafsir and fiqh way, however important it is, but in the way of creating knowledge based on a Quranic framework.
I just really want to make an important point. I mean, I think this question this gentleman asked is a really good one about, what's the point of Ummah or whatever. I mean, for me, I don't want to speak to anyone else, but for me, I didn't when I became Muslim, I didn't switch teams, like when I started voting for a new football team, something like that. I think I'm interested in these political questions because I believe people have a right to self-determination, and communities have the right to determine their own future. And if you look at recent history, just over and over again, is the refusal on the part of the United States and other Western countries to allow Muslims to determine their own future. That's what is so offensive to me. I mean, it's not that I think that somehow. Muslims have a right to this and no one else does. I don't think that at all. I think as Muslims we actually respect, one of the things we respect other people's autonomy to the point that we will, and Irfan Ahmed talks about this in his paper, but to the point that we would, even if people were living under Muslim rule, we would allow them to do things that we actually find morally objectionable, like beyond the pale of what we would consider morally acceptable, because they have a commitment to a religious commitment that we honor. So I think it's an important question to think about, what the gentleman asked.
I actually really appreciate your question because you brought two concepts together. You were saying, how can we bridge a cosmology and a cosmogony, right? And cosmogony is our understanding of how the earth comes to be. Because for the second year in a row, we haven't talked about environmentalism, right? How do we relate to the earth? Does the self relate to the earth? How is our afia actually connected to one another, to the way that, climate change is changing and all of that. So I think you're right in terms of what are our frameworks that could bring back this entwinement of cosmology and cosmogony, and what kind of frameworks of the self would that kind of generate?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Abdurrahman Bakil from Yemen. So the first suggestion is regarding the entrepreneurship, and if Ummatics project can go more with the entrepreneurs and to have more gatherings regarding the businesses, so we can have more entrepreneurs getting along, and then can have also the Islamic point of view in terms of their businesses and so on. This is one. Second one is we have to understand that we are having around 56 Muslim countries, right? So every country has its own demography and their own way and culture and tradition. So if also Ummatics project can understand each country demography, and based on that we are talking to the people, because we are having in Malaysia a multicultural, multiracial country, other than Arab countries, tribalism and so on. So if we can focus on that, it's going to be great also. Last but not least is the question is, why most of our Muslim fellow talking about the Gulf countries, that they are the most responsible people for the current attack or the current issues between Israel and Gaza and Palestine. While we are having 56 countries, what the other countries are doing, regardless of the Gulf countries' stance. Thank you.
Would anybody like to take that question? I say that as I believe it's a rhetorical question and well taken.
Because, I don't know, most of those countries don't normalize with Israel, and they don't do so in grotesque situations, and they don't do so in a way that is claim some kind of moral high ground, and they don't do so and then send their pathetic influencers to go to nightclubs and dance in the streets of Tel Aviv and get arrested by the police for wearing shorts, that kind of stuff. I mean, that's just my personal opinion.
Because I think at the end, the heart of Islam geographically is where Mecca and Medina is and the area around it. At the end, this is the heart of Islam. This is where Islam started. And this is where the Quranic language is spoken. And this is where you expect people to stand with Muslims when they are attacked, versus stand with the enemies and attack with the enemies, and so on. But of course, there has been a major re-engineering of the heart of Islam, starting from Mecca and Medina, and of course the Gulf countries, but I'm talking particularly in Mecca and Medina and the region around it, especially in the past decade, re-engineering of these societies in order to prevent revolt and so on. But basically what is happening is a redefining of Islam and in these countries, and that is why critiquing them is very important. And yes, it will cost you, visa issues and some security issues, but this is the least of our worries versus the reality of these countries. They claim to be on a moral ground, they claim to represent Islam, they give themselves the nicest Islamic titles, but at the end, the countries around Palestine are responsible, and they have the blood of Palestinians on their hand. This is a fact.
Thank you very much. And as for your point about entrepreneurs, you're absolutely noted. Great point. We do plan to work on that. And your point about environmentalism, that's been on our list. We asked you to do it. So please, let's see. Yes, go ahead. I took 2 from there, so I'll take 2 from here. You can go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Thank you so much for the great panel discussion. I'm from Kuala Lumpur. I'm a retired physician. I took early retirement from my family. And I mentioned that because it's relevant to what I wanted to say. Firstly, from what Professor Ashwak was asking earlier on about whether you would say no to your physician, was it?
Would you be suspicious of his diagnosis?
Would you say no to your physician's diagnosis?
So whether you would be suspicious of your...
Suspicious, okay. So I would just like to highlight that certain events in the last 5 to 10 years have actually shown us that science is not immune to ideology. And 2 events in particular have highlighted this very clearly. And the first one is the transgender movement. And if anyone is interested in it, you can read up about what happened to the Tavistock Clinic, which was under the NHS in the UK. And that's the first example. And the second example was the outbreak of monkeypox not too long ago. And for those who are interested, again, you can look up the case of Dr. Dawn Weiss, who was the epidemiologist in charge in New York City, who was not allowed to make the correct public health advice because it would offend certain people. I mean, I think you know who those people are. So I'm not asking you to distrust your doctor, but I'm just saying that science, you know, when they say follow the science, follow the evidence, always bear in mind that it's not immune to ideology. And the second thing I wanted to say was, which is also relevant, that I'm a retired physician, is that whenever there's a problem in front of us, for someone like myself, the first question to ask is always, what is the diagnosis? What is the correct diagnosis? Because if you don't make the correct diagnosis, you will not give the correct treatment. And that has been proven time and time again. So another thing I would say is that both my parents were economics majors. And listening to the discourse about capitalism versus socialism, etc., and the fact that my parents were trained in the sort of mythical, as Auda would say, Keynesian school of economics, which is very, very much entrenched in Western academia, I have never been able to understand economics taught by in Western academia, despite, I'm not a lay person, but I'm not an economist either. But I would have thought simple precepts would have been quite obvious to me. Like, why would you lower interest rates to encourage spending, to recover from a recession? All these things didn't make sense to me. And so, sorry, I'll get to my point. It appears to me that the problem isn't really capitalism v. socialism or any of these other things. It's actually the issue of sound money, which I don't really hear much in the discourse when we talk about how to get out of capitalism, how to get out from the gap between the rich and the poor and the ever-expanding gap. When the actual issue is actually whether the money, the currency that we're using is sound money or not. I don't know if anybody...
Thank you very much, Jasser. Excellent intervention. Would anybody like to respond? It was a comment, but yes.
Yeah, of course, I'm going to respond to the issue of economics, not the physician. You can do that. I appreciate what you're saying about sound money. And I think this is the kind of discussion and the kind of arguments that we need to bring forward. And obviously, among Muslims, there will be different positions. Some Muslims will believe that capitalism can be reformed, and others, like myself, would believe that it cannot be reformed. But this is what needs to be discussed. But the main thing is that we need to get into these discussions. In the field of economics, there is something called Islamic economics. Now, Islamic economics basically is neoclassical economics, dressed up in Islamic terminology. And the problem with the field of economics is that it tends to be rather, ideologically homogeneous. You don't have, unlike sociology, in sociology departments you have, scholars from different perspectives, opposing perspectives. But economics is rather homogeneous. It starts with the assumption that capitalism is good, it is the only possible system, and so on and so forth. And the method is very abstract. It doesn't deal with data. I'm talking about neoclassical. It doesn't deal with data. And the Muslims have followed that, rather than studying real life economies historically as well as contemporary, and rather than studying the economies of Muslims in pre-modern times and developing concepts from that. You're talking about having sound money. Fine, we can talk about that, but I'm saying think about whether it's possible to have a society without money. Is it possible in what they call post-scarcity? People are talking about this. It's not just an idea which people plucked up from the sky, right? So let's talk about these things.
No, I definitely agree, and there was many reasons why I said what I said in the way that I said it. I think we don't think a lot about what it means to decolonize science, and one of the reasons we don't is because there's this Orientalist like projections. If Muslims were to start saying, we're not believers of science, we get to be called backwards. Or if we question science, we get to be considered unpositivistic, unempirical. And that is very much a problem, which is why much of this conference is about politics and economy, and not really about different sciences that we need to think about. What does it mean to have an Islamic epistemology? What does it mean to have a Muslim psychology? What does it mean to have an Islamic biomedical framework? We don't do that because we're still stuck in civil wars, trying to save people in Gaza from bleeding out. We're triaging the Ummah, but we're not really thinking about how do we start recreating our own sciences. And I think the reason is because we are not yet able to be proud of our own history and our own accomplishments within the sciences. And I think only then are we able to reinherit our tradition.
Thank you very much. So we have 4 minutes left. I'm going to stop at 5:30. And I'll take a question on this side. Go ahead, please.
All right. Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah khair, all of you. Very quickly, I'm a biomedically trained psychiatrist, but I'm a practicing relational psychiatrist. I would like to second most of what you said with respect to how so much of the diagnostic categories have to be taken suspiciously. We have reified them. There's not enough empirical evidence for them either, and there's logically a lot of problems with the DSM, but the practice in general. And as Sheikh Attar was also talking about Islamic economics being just classical economics with Islamic terminologies and framing, we can say the same about Islamic psychology, that it also presupposes that individualism is great, and then everything that is used in the Islamic terminology precludes essentially an Ummatic consciousness from developing. However, when we approach our colleagues in the field who have been subjectivized, if you will, with all of that, would it not serve us well, and all of you have been in the field and experienced this, a rather therapeutic technique of validating so much of what is true from within that framework? We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and how that would at least get us in so that the critical part of what we have to offer is then they're more open to, and then the conversation develops from there.
Absolutely. I don't mean just throw out all of Muslim psychology. I don't know if you know I've written a little bit about how the expansion of the category of mental illness was expanded on by Muslim physicians such as Ibn Abi Sadiq. So I'm not saying that we throw the baby out with the bathwater at all, but I'm also saying not to take certain concepts for granted, right? Like ego psychology, like these pop psychology terms, like learned helplessness, anxiety. Like there's all these definitions that are predicated on a particular framework of the psyche, right? In a particular like frame of the ego. And actually like the most innovative psychotherapists right now are psychoanalysts, which are actually like ridiculed. People like Jacques Lacan, because he actually engaged the Muslim tradition into trying to think about the role of the imagination, or trying to think about the role of the law in treating neuroses and even psychosis. So there is a way to glean from the tradition and try to understand how it could expand Western psychotherapeutics. And instead of saying, oh, we don't, it's not like we don't believe in the unconscious or consciousness, or we don't believe in psychosis. I mean, psychosis is real, schizophrenia is real, but I'm wondering how can we expand these parameters by engaging our tradition, and we have to be able to take our tradition seriously and do the research to show the evidence, because it is there historically. But thank you so much for your question.
Okay, unfortunately, I'll have to take one final question from you, sister. There's 1 minute left.
If that's the case, I think I can give it to the brother, because I think he stood before me.
That's okay.
Yeah, you can. No worries.
I'll let you two decide it.
Jazakallah khair. Just a quick question. So all over the Western world, Muslims have been talking about the Muslim vote strategy to punish politicians for their stance on Palestine. I'm curious what the panel thinks about whether this is an example of Ummatic thinking and Ummatic political strategy, or is this thinking too small?
Sorry, thinking...
Too small.
Too small. The question, if I understand the question, is about using the Muslim bloc in Western countries voting to penalize politicians like abandon Biden or something.
Yep.
Okay. Would anybody like to say anything? Jack, why don't you take this?
It's asking whether Ummatics takes this as part of its strategy, or this is too small and Ummatics have...
So the question of, I'll take the question of Ummatics part. I'm very fond of Islamic tradition, and I think we need to critically engage it. And in the tradition, so many problems that have come up in many different ways. It remains our responsibility to choose which divisions, which categories remain relevant. And one of them is between fiqh and siyasa. Fiqh is reading of scripture, revelation, and applying it on our deciding or reading what is normative and what we do not have a choice about, what is acceptable, what is mubah, mustahab, and so on. And then there is a question of siyasa, which is something I work on, which is underdeveloped. But nevertheless, there is great wisdom there. And one of the things that I think we have to recognize as Muslims is if a question belongs to siyasa, do not try to solve it with tools of fiqh. Meaning that if you cannot, if you think that it's a question of halal and haram, if you, for example, believe voting in a Muslim country or in a non-Muslim country is absolutely haram, then you have a certain answer to that question. Then it's not a matter of siyasa, it's a matter of sharia, you have decided that. But you also have to accept that Muslim scholars have disagreed, and that disagreement, legitimate disagreement, is an essential part of fiqh. So if you're going to use the language of fiqh, you have to understand the multiplicity and multivocality of fiqh. So you could say, I'm in disagreement with voting. I personally do not vote in the United States, but other Muslims, scholars that are better than me, I know, make an argument for it. So that's a fiqhi question. But then there's the question of siyasa. And siyasa is with the maqasid, with the objectives of Islam and the interests of the Muslim community in mind. In this case, the interests of the Muslim Ummah in mind. We do our best ijtihad, not reading out of the text, but reading the science that we can, empirical data, political science. If you are in conservative circles, you read things in a certain way. If you're in the leftist circles, you're interested in critiques of capitalism and establishment in a different way. And so long as it's a matter of siyasa and what you're doing is justified within Islamic frame and your interest is the ummah, then what you're doing is ummatic siyasa. All you have to do is persuade other Muslims that your reading of the siyasa and your commitment to the Quran and the Sunnah and the purposes and the interests of Muslims are better than others. And I think that that's why I don't weigh in on the question of whether, particular voting or abandon Biden is the ummatic approach and others who are not doing it are abandoning the ummah. There's no way for us epistemologically to make that argument. I can give you my political opinion, but that will be just my political opinion. So we'll end with that, inshallah. Since our time is up, Sheikh Jasser, please end with the dua for us. Jazakumullah khair.
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا وأخطأنا. ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا. ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. اللهم إنا نجعلك في نحور أعدائنا ونعوذ بك من شرورهم. اللهم فل حدهم. اللهم أدل دولهم. اللهم انصرنا عليهم. اللهم يا مجري السحاب ويا هازم الأحزاب اللهم اهزمهم وانصرنا عليهم. اللهم إنا نعوذ برضاك من سخطك ونعوذ بعفوك من عقوبتك ونعوذ بك منك لا نحصي ثناء عليك أنت كما أثنيت على نفسك. اللهم كن لنا ولا تكن علينا وانصرنا ولا تنصر علينا وآثرنا ولا تؤثر علينا وانكر لنا ولا تمكر علينا وخذل عنا ولا تخذلنا. اللهم إنا نعوذ برضاك من سخطك ونعوذ بعفوك من عقوبتك ونعوذ بك منك لا نحصي ثناء عليك. وصل اللهم على محمد النبي الأمي وآله وصحبه.
Jazakumullah khairan, everyone, and especially to the esteemed panel for giving us some very useful closing reflections. Jazakumullah khairan again. We couldn't do this without you, and I really want to thank all of the people behind the scenes, behind the scenes, and akramakumullah, jazakumullah khairan. Brother Ashraf, Brother Uthman, Sister Yasmin, so many people working on this for months and months, and for it to come finally to fruition with your participation. Jazakumullah khairan. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.